Who's the richest person in history? You might think it's Elon Musk with his fortune pushing over $400 billion. But what if I told you he doesn't even come close? Imagine someone so wealthy their personal spending crashed the economy of an entire country. Imagine another ruler who controlled nearly 1/4 of the world's GDP at the height of his power, or an oil tycoon whose fortune, adjusted for today, would make Musk and Bezos look like middle class. The truth is, history's richest men weren't just billionaires. They were emperors, conquerors, and kings whose wealth was so staggering it reshaped the world around them. And here's the twist: depending on how you measure wealth, the title of richest person ever keeps changing hands. From African kings to Roman emperors to ruthless industrialists to the tech moguls of today. So buckle up, because the story of the richest person in history isn't just about money. It's about power, greed, and influence on a scale the modern world can barely imagine. Let's start with the billionaires we all know today. Elon Musk, the face of Tesla and SpaceX, has reached a peak fortune of about $400 billion. That makes him the richest man alive right now. $400 billion. It's so much money that he could, in theory, buy entire countries like Greece or New Zealand outright. Then comes Jeff Bezos, the man who turned an online bookstore into the trillion-dollar giant Amazon. At his peak, Bezos was worth around $200 billion, enough to buy every single sports team in the NFL, NBA, and MLB combined, and still have money left over. Bernard Arnault, the king of luxury, went with brands like Louis Vuitton, Dior, and Moet Hennessy, sits in the same league, crossing $220 billion. And Bill Gates, even after giving away more than half his fortune, still hovers around $130 billion. These numbers sound mind-blowing. Musk at $400 billion, Bezos at $200 billion, Arnault and Gates in the hundreds of billions. It feels like we're living in the age of the richest humans ever, right? But here's the twist: as shocking as these numbers sound, they don't even come close to history's true giants. Because once we step back and compare them to people like John D. Rockefeller, Augustus Caesar, or Mansa Musa, we realize Musk and Bezos are just scratching the surface. In fact, some men from the past were so wealthy their fortunes weren't measured in billions, they were measured in trillions. Now, let's step back 100 years. Before Elon Musk, before Bezos, before tech companies ruled the world, there was one man who became the symbol of wealth itself: John D. Rockefeller, the oil king, the man who built Standard Oil into a monopoly so massive, so powerful that the US government had to break it apart in 1911. At his peak, Rockefeller was worth around $400 billion in today's dollars. That's nearly the same as Elon Musk today. But here's the key difference: Musk's wealth goes up and down with stock prices. Rockefeller's wealth was rooted in the most valuable resource of his time: oil. And unlike Tesla shares, oil wasn't a bet on the future. It powered the entire industrial revolution. By the 1900s, Rockefeller controlled over 90% of America's oil industry. Think about that for a second. Imagine if one person today owned 90% of all the world's tech companies: Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Facebook, every single one of them. That's the kind of dominance Rockefeller had. Now, here's the number that really blows minds. Rockefeller's net worth was equal to about 2% of the entire US economy. Compare that to Elon Musk, whose $400 billion fortune is less than 0.2% of the US economy. In other words, Rockefeller wasn't just richer in dollars, he was richer in power, influence, and control. And his impact didn't stop at money. Rockefeller shaped philanthropy as we know it today. He gave away more than $500 million during his lifetime, billions in today's terms, funding universities, medical research, and public health initiatives. But here's the kicker: even after giving away a fortune that would have made him one of the richest men alive today, he still died in 1937 as the wealthiest American in history. So when people say Elon Musk is the richest man ever, history has a different answer. Rockefeller, in raw economic dominance, beat Musk by 10-1. He didn't just compete in a market, he owned the market. And as jaw-dropping as Rockefeller's empire was, he wasn't alone, because another titan of industry, his rival in steel, was about to become even richer. If John D. Rockefeller was the king of oil, then his counterpart in the steel industry was Andrew Carnegie. And believe it or not, Carnegie's fortune was so enormous that in terms of personal wealth, he may have actually outshined Rockefeller. Carnegie started with nothing. Born in Scotland in 1835, he immigrated to America as a poor teenager, working in textile mills for just $1.20 a week. From there, he climbed the ladder, first as a telegraph messenger, then in the railroads, and finally into steel. His company, Carnegie Steel, became the largest and most efficient steel producer in the world. At a time when America was building railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers, Carnegie supplied the steel that made it possible. He wasn't just rich, he literally built the backbone of the modern United States. By the time he sold Carnegie Steel to JP Morgan in 1901, the deal was valued at $480 million, which in today's money is about $310 billion. That instantly made Andrew Carnegie one of the richest men in history. But here's the twist. That was just the cash-out figure. His total wealth at the peak of his empire was estimated at well over $350 to $400 billion in today's dollars. Yes, almost the same as Elon Musk today. But remember, Carnegie's money wasn't tied to volatile stock prices. It was built on the raw steel powering an entire industrial nation. And here's where it gets even more shocking. Carnegie was famous for his philanthropy. In his later years, he gave away about 90% of his fortune to libraries, universities, scientific research, and world peace initiatives. He once said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." Think about that. Imagine if Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos gave away $300 billion of their wealth while still alive. Carnegie did exactly that, funding more than 2,500 libraries across the world, creating Carnegie Mellon University, and even attempting to prevent World War I by financing peace movements. Yet, even after giving almost everything away, historians still rank Carnegie among the top 5 richest men of all time. His fortune was so vast that if he kept it all, he would have easily surpassed Rockefeller, Bezos, and Musk combined. So while Rockefeller dominated oil, Carnegie dominated steel, and together they shaped the foundations of America's wealth. But the 20th century wasn't just about industrial titans. There was another figure who didn't measure his wealth in billions of dollars, but in the sheer control of an entire nation's economy: Adolf Hitler. Up until now, we've been talking about men who built fortunes out of industries, oil, steel, technology. But what happens when someone doesn't just get rich, but takes control of an entire country's economy? That's exactly what happened under Adolf Hitler. Now, Hitler isn't usually included in richest man in history lists, because technically his personal bank account wasn't worth hundreds of billions. But here's the shocking reality. By the late 1930s, Hitler had control over the entire German economy, one of the most advanced industrial powers in the world at the time. To put that into perspective, Germany's GDP under the Nazi regime was valued at the equivalent of about $400 to $450 billion in 1940s money. Adjusted to today's standards, that's trillions of dollars in economic output. And unlike a CEO, Hitler wasn't just managing the state. He literally commanded every factory, every mine, every soldier, and every resource. Consider this. Elon Musk's $400 billion is tied to Tesla and SpaceX. If markets crash, his fortune evaporates. But Hitler, he could mobilize the entire German economy to build tanks, planes, weapons, and highways overnight. He didn't just have wealth, he had economic dominance. And yes, Hitler did enrich himself personally too. He collected royalties from his book Mein Kampf, which was forced upon German households, earning him millions. He lived in lavish estates seized from opponents, and he personally controlled the art, land, and assets stolen during World War II. Some historians suggest his personal wealth could have reached the equivalent of billions of dollars. But here's the disturbing truth. Hitler's wealth wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in power. He could print money, he could seize industries, he could redirect the labor of millions of people toward his goals. No billionaire today has that kind of absolute control, and that's what makes Hitler such a unique figure in the wealth debate. He wasn't just a leader, he was an economic dictator. While Rockefeller and Carnegie owned industries, Hitler owned an entire nation's economy, which raises a bigger question. How do we really measure wealth? In dollars or in control? Because if it's about control, then Hitler stands closer to emperors like Augustus Caesar than to Elon Musk. And speaking of emperors, the deeper we go into history, the bigger these fortunes get. Which brings us to the kings and rulers whose wealth was so vast it makes even Rockefeller look small. Men like Mansa Musa of Mali. We've talked about industrial titans, we've talked about dictators, but now let's go back 700 years to West Africa, to a king whose wealth is so legendary modern economists can't even put a number on it. His name was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire in the 14th century. And if you've never heard of him, here's why you should. Historians often call him the richest man in all of human history. Musa's empire sat on some of the world's largest reserves of gold and salt, the two most valuable resources of the Middle Ages. Imagine being Elon Musk today, but instead of building cars or rockets, you literally own the world's gold supply. That was Musa. His fortune has been estimated at the modern equivalent of $400 to $500 billion. Some historians even argue that's too low. His wealth was basically so vast that it becomes incalculable. And here's the craziest story. In 1324, Musa went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Along the way, he traveled with an entourage of tens of thousands of people, including slaves, soldiers, and attendants. And most importantly, he carried so much gold that he literally gave it away to entire cities. In Cairo, Musa handed out gold like candy, so much that he caused a decade-long economic crash. Think about about that. One man's generosity destroyed the value of gold in an entire region for 10 straight years. Now compare that to today's billionaires. Elon Musk's tweets can move the stock market a few percent. Jeff Bezos selling shares might dip Amazon's value for a week. But Mansa Musa, a single trip from West Africa to Mecca, shifted the global economy. And beyond money, Musa invested in culture. He built mosques, libraries, and the legendary city of Timbuktu, a hub of learning that attracted scholars from across the world. He wasn't just the richest man alive, he was also shaping the intellectual and cultural map of his time. Here's the mind bender. While Musk's fortune might rise or fall tomorrow, Mansa Musa's wealth wasn't paper, stocks, or cryptocurrency. It was gold, land, and resources, real wealth, tangible power. So when people today debate who's the richest man ever, it's almost laughable, because by most accounts, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, even Rockefeller were all playing in billions. Musa, he was playing in civilization-level trillions. But Musa wasn't alone. As we move further back into ancient history, the wealth numbers get even more mind-blowing, which brings us to rulers who treated entire empires as their personal bank accounts, like the Roman emperors, whose fortunes redefined what it meant to be rich. After Mansa Musa, you might think no one else could compare, but let's travel back even further to the very heart of the ancient world, Rome. And at the center of it all was Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome, the man who turned the Roman Republic into a global empire. And along the way, he also became one of the richest individuals in all of history. Historians estimate Augustus controlled a personal fortune equivalent to $4.6 trillion today. That's trillion with a T. To put that in perspective, Elon Musk at his peak hit $400 billion. That means Augustus was roughly 10 times richer than Musk at his richest. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just private wealth sitting in a bank account. Augustus controlled the Roman state treasury, the military, and the flow of trade from the Mediterranean to the Middle East. At its peak, Rome accounted for about a quarter of the world's total GDP. And Augustus, he sat at the top of it all. Imagine having not just a company, not just a nation, but an empire, and being able to treat its resources like your own. That's the difference between Musk and Augustus. Musk runs Tesla and SpaceX. Augustus literally ran civilization. His wealth came from every angle: conquest, taxes, trade, land, and tribute from conquered regions. Think about the sheer power. Augustus could fund roads that stretched across continents, feed millions through grain imports from Egypt, and still maintain private estates so vast they rivaled entire modern cities. And unlike today's billionaires, Augustus's wealth wasn't vulnerable to stock crashes or market shifts. It was solid: land, gold, resources, labor. He could simply decree wealth into existence. In fact, he even controlled the minting of coins. So in a very real way, Augustus Caesar literally printed money with his own face on it. The insane part? While Musk or Bezos can influence markets with a single decision, Augustus shaped the destiny of an empire that lasted for centuries. If Musk is a billionaire CEO, Augustus was a trillionaire god king. And that brings us to the even bigger players, the rulers whose wealth wasn't just economic, but cosmic. Because if Augustus ruled Rome, then others like the pharaohs of Egypt, pyramids and treasures that still boggle the imagination today. If Augustus Caesar ruled as the wealthiest man of Rome, then the pharaohs of Egypt played an even greater role. They weren't just rulers, they were gods on earth. And with that divine status came wealth that makes today's billionaires look like pocket change. Take Pharaoh Tutankhamun, for example. When his tomb was discovered in 1922, it stunned the world. Gold masks, jeweled daggers, thrones, solid gold coffins, artifacts so valuable that even a single piece could rival a billionaire's art collection. And here's the crazy part. Tutankhamun wasn't even one of the greatest pharaohs. He died young, and yet his burial chamber overflowed with unimaginable riches. Now imagine the treasures buried with pharaohs like Ramses II or Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. Historians estimate that the wealth under their control would be worth trillions in today's money. Land, gold mines, armies of workers, and trade routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to Africa and beyond. Unlike today's billionaires who build companies and compete on stock charts, pharaohs owned everything their eyes could see. The Nile, the farms, the labor force, the temples, all of it was essentially their private property, and they had absolute power to demand tribute from anyone who lived under the sun of Egypt. Let's compare. Jeff Bezos at his peak was worth about $200 billion. That sounds massive, until you realize that Ramses II, by sheer control of land and resources, would have commanded wealth possibly 10 to 20 times that. And he didn't just use it for luxury. He built temples like Abu Simbel, monuments so massive they still stand after 3,000 years. That's not buying a yacht, that's carving your name into eternity. And here's where it gets It's eerie. While Musk's Tesla factories and Bezos' Amazon empire might one day fade, the pharaoh's legacy of wealth is literally still here. The pyramids, the tombs, the treasures, they've lasted millennia, surviving plunder, wars, and even the desert itself. But here's the twist. Much of their wealth is still hidden. Archaeologists believe there are undiscovered tombs and chambers, possibly filled with treasures we can't even imagine. Think about that. 3,000 years later, the pharaohs may still be richer than today's billionaires simply because their gold is buried, untouched, waiting to be found. The pharaohs weren't just rich, they were immortalized by their wealth. And that's the ultimate flex. When your fortune doesn't just buy influence, it buys a place in history forever. But as powerful as Egypt's pharaohs were, another empire would rise in the east. An empire where a single ruler could control more people, more land, and more riches than almost anyone else before him. And that takes us to the Mongol Khans, whose conquests rewrote the definition of wealth on a global scale. After the Roman emperors, the story of wealth doesn't shrink, it explodes. Because next comes a man whose fortune wasn't just about gold or land, but about sheer domination of the planet. His name was Genghis Khan. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous empire in human history. From China to Europe, his empire stretched across nearly 12 million square miles. That's more than the size of Africa today. Now think about what that means in terms of wealth. Historians estimate that at the height of his power, Genghis Khan controlled resources equivalent to $120 trillion in modern terms. Let that number sink in. $120 trillion. That's more than the combined GDP of the entire world right now. But here's the fascinating twist. Unlike Rockefeller or Bezos, Genghis didn't hoard his wealth in banks or vaults. He didn't need to. His wealth was power itself. Entire kingdoms, trade routes, cities, and armies existed under his command. If he wanted gold, he took it. If he wanted silk, spices, or horses, they were his. One story goes that his empire was so secure, a single woman carrying a pouch of gold could walk unarmed across his territories without fear of being robbed. That was the kind of order and dominance his rule created. Now compare that to today. Elon Musk may have rockets, Bezos may have Amazon, but Genghis Khan had the Silk Road, the lifeline of trade that connected east and west, and he controlled it like his personal business empire. Here's the most mind-blowing part. While Musk and Bezos might one day lose their fortunes to market crashes or government regulation, Genghis Khan's empire was built on conquest and fear. No board meetings, no shareholders, just absolute authority. So when we talk about the richest men in history, we can't measure Khan's fortune in just dollars. His wealth was civilizations, his currency was loyalty and fear, and his legacy was written across continents. And yet even Genghis Khan wasn't the final level, because if he commanded empires, there were others who believed they commanded divine wealth, treasures so legendary that even thousands of years later, we're still digging for them. We've looked at emperors, conquerors, and kings who built their fortunes with armies and empires. But now let's enter a different kind of story, a story that comes straight from the Bible itself. King Solomon of Israel. According to ancient texts, Solomon's wealth wasn't just enormous, it was almost beyond comprehension. Some sources even describe it as incalculable. The Bible says Solomon received 25 tons of gold every single year. That's over $1.5 billion annually in today's money. And that's not even counting taxes, trade, or treasures given as gifts by neighboring kings and queens. His palace and temple were said to be decorated with gold so abundant it was treated like common stone. One legendary moment, the Queen of Sheba visiting Jerusalem. She arrived with caravans loaded with spices, jewels, and gold, offering tributes to a king whose reputation for wealth and wisdom had already spread across continents. Some historians estimate Solomon's fortune might have reached the modern equivalent of $2 trillion. Others argue the numbers are exaggerated or symbolic, but here's the key. Even if the figures are debated, the idea of Solomon's wealth has lived on for thousands of years. Compare that to today. Elon Musk might trend on Twitter for a day. Jeff Bezos might make headlines for a yacht. But Solomon, his name is still spoken in churches, synagogues, and mosques around the world. 3,000 years later, that's a legacy no modern billionaire can buy. And here's the most fascinating part. Solomon's wealth wasn't just gold. It was tied to his reputation for wisdom. He wasn't remembered only as the richest man of his era. He was remembered as the man who combined wealth, power, and divine favor. Which brings us to the ultimate question. After all these kings, emperors, and billionaires, who was truly the richest of all time? Was it Rockefeller, Musa, Solomon, or is it impossible to crown just one? So after all this, after exploring Rockefeller's oil empire, Hitler's plundered war machine, Mansa Musa's golden pilgrimage, Augustus Caesar's trillion-dollar Rome, the pharaohs of Egypt, Genghis Khan's endless land, and even Solomon's legendary fortune, the question remains, who was truly the richest person in history? If you go by pure numbers, Mansa Musa is often crowned the king. His $400 to $500 billion fortune makes Elon Musk's net worth look small. If you count empire control, control, Augustus Caesar might take the title. His $4.6 trillion grip on Rome's economy made him richer than any single human ever recorded. If you factor in land, Genghis Khan's empire of $120 trillion worth of territory dwarfs even modern nations. And if you add in legend and faith, then Solomon might be the richest of all, not just in gold, but in wisdom and in legacy that still shapes cultures today. So maybe the real answer is this: wealth is bigger than just money. It can be land, power, resources, or even influence that lasts thousands of years. Today's billionaires may dominate headlines, but the wealth of history's greatest figures makes even the richest men alive look like pocket change. And that's what makes this so fascinating, because it's not just about numbers. It's about how wealth shaped civilizations, crashed economies, built empires, and created legends that outlived time itself. But what do you think? Who do you believe deserves the crown as the richest human who ever lived? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. And if you love this journey through history's greatest fortunes, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got even more mind-blowing stories coming your way. Mysteries, history, power, and secrets you won't want to miss.